Good morning, everybody, and good evening also to all participants from one side to the other of the world. I'm really delighted and honored to chair this important event today, which is really well attended and with the participation of an impressive number of people. Since I guess I'm not the main reason for this achievement, I'd better go quickly forward with my introduction. My name is Augusto Preta. I am the chairman of the Italian chapter of the IIC, and I am also an economic consultant in media and telecom markets. Since we are very welcome to receive questions from the audience, after the panel have finished speaking via the Q&A function button, you can start making the question. However, due to the expected number of participants, questions are limited to the maximum of one per delegate. So the today webinar is very important for the Italian chapter for a bunch of reasons. This is our first event of this year. It arrives after a few months of stop for pandemic on our activities, so it looks like a brand new start. Also important because the topics of today's meeting, the EECC code, is a clear example of a major trend involving all the communication sector in Europe. Therefore, we at the IIC truly believe that there is a role to play for us also in this particular subject in the EU policy debate, where there is a need for independent cross-sector dialogue an organization such as the IIC can afford. On this regard, today's meeting follows another important IIC initiative on the same subject, also promoted by the Italy chapter, the so-called IIC European Chapter Initiative. The three chapters based in Europe were involved, Italy, UK, and Brussels, through a series of events in 19 and 2020, taking place in different countries before pandemic, where we discussed some of the main relevant and sometimes controversial aspects of the code, with the aim to provide an ideal platform for such a dialogue. I guess some of the participants who are here today also took part of these events. In any case, you can also get a report of those events on the IIC website. Today, we discuss again of this important piece of regulation, and we will focus in particular on the interplay between competition enhancement and promotion of innovative investment. The first one has been historically a crucial aspect of the EU telecom markets regulation for the last 20 years. Due to the increasing importance of investment in next generation access networks, the regulatory framework has progressively evolved and investment promotion has become a new relevant general objective of the European regulatory framework. The new electronic communication code, which was supposed to enter into force at the end of last year in December, marks a new era for telecom regulation in Europe. In particular, the EECC code encouraged network sharing and co-investment. In particular, regulatory authorities might impose under the EECC code network sharing to promote effective and efficient use of the spectrum, the rapid development of the network, effective competition of the environment, public health, public security, and so on. National regulatory authorities might also require co-investment, include the co-ownership, long-term sharing, co-financing, and purchase agreement, giving the rise to specific right of a structural character. National regulators might encourage co-investment by refraining from imposing or rolling back cost-oriented access regulation. And all these conditions as well defined by the code. So in this new environment, as you may guess, there is a great role to play for the national regulatory authorities, as well as the BEREC. And that gives me the opportunity to involve in this discussion our next speaker, Dr. Jacob Mulasso, AGCOM president, who I guess have something to say on this specific subject. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to also on behalf of the IIC, to have him here today. Dr. Lasorella has been a civil servant for all his professional life and was appointed president with an unanimously vote by the Italian Parliament last September. It's a great achievement, I can tell you, especially in a country like Italy. And also makes this a sort of newcomer in some way. Apart from that, he's a jurist, a kind, educated person that with a solid knowledge of law and a great vocation to look out of the window at the international aspect, something really important in the communication sector this time. And so with this perspective, he has been called to regulate this transformation in the next year. I'm confident he will give his own mark to the AGCOM and enforce it as an independent and authoritative regulators in the year to come. Having said of that, Mr. President, we can't wait anymore to hear from you. The floor, Dr. Lasorella, is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Mr. Preda, for your nice word. I'd like to thank the Italian chapter of the IIC, the International Institute for Communication, for offering me the opportunity to open such an interesting event. As you know, I took on duty as president of AGCOM just a few months ago, and I'm pleased to take this opportunity to confirm our enduring contribution to the IIC initiatives. I would also like to thank Professor Antonio Nicita and Professor Antonio Manganelli, both very good acquaintances, if I may say, of AGCOM, not only as distinguished law and economic scholars, but also one as an authoritative member of the former council, the other as a consultant of AGCOM. The occasion for today's meeting is their very interesting and recently published essay, which provides a critical, comprehensive summary of the co-evolution of telecom markets, of the rules and the public institution over the last 25 years, since the early steps of liberalization back in the 90s, up to the most recent policy initiative aiming at boosting investments and innovation. The book closely investigates the interplay, as Mr. Preta recalled, between regulation and competition law enforcement, and the evolution of consumer empowerment policies in respect to consumer decision-making and behavior. It also evaluates the interplay between classical regulatory approaches, Martin Cave's ladder of investments, and emerging regulatory challenges aimed at meeting the ultra-fast broadband goals of the EU gigabit society. The evolution of mobile communication and spectrum policy in the 5G scenario and the digital transformation driven by OTTs complete an essay that draws lessons from past experience and makes some very interesting suggestions for the upcoming regulatory issues. In a word, it is an essential reading both for regulators and policymakers. A key question underlying Nicita and Manganelli's book is the potential dualism, the potential tension between competition and promotion of investment in very high capacity networks. In the context of the new European Code of Electronic Communication. A second question naturally connected to the first is, how does such dualism, if at all, impact the activities of national regulators? I have no doubt that today's panel speaker will give us a great contribution in discussing such fundamental issues, and I'm very keen to listen to the following intervention. Before, I would like to share with you some very general remarks about this matter, also looking at the upcoming national implementation of the code. As a matter of fact, opinions about the relationship between competition and investments in all network industries, not just in telecoms, are very often influenced by dogmatic approaches and sometimes biased by the intrinsic power play between sectorial regulation and industrial policy. It seems to me that this was probably what happened also during the legislative debate on the code, driving to polarized position and making it difficult to reach a political compromise. However, I think it is reasonable to say that the code finally managed to strike a fair balance in the pursuit of these two regulatory goals. Indeed, according to Article 3 of the code, there is a new regulatory objective that is added to the three traditional objectives of promoting competition, contributing to the development of the internal market, and promoting the interest of the EU citizens. That of promoting connectivity and take-up of very high-capacity networks. Following a specific request of NRA, the code does not introduce a hierarchy among these regulatory objectives, leaving to national regulators and to the European Commission in exercises their own duties within the regulatory process the task of identifying the right options for the pursuit of such goals, also on the basis of national specific needs. The same multi-level cooperative approach is confirmed by the various regulatory tools specifically tailored to the promotion of the connectivity goals. I'm thinking in particular to the special regulatory regime foreseen for undertakings committing to deploy new VHCN elements in a co-investment scenario. The combination of substantive condition identified by Article 76 and Annex 4 and rules of procedure defined by Article 79 and Article 33, while clearly addressing co-investment as a key tool to develop high-capacity networks, allow at the same time NRA to use the right flexibility in order to duly monitor competitive market dynamics and check that end-user welfare is not reduced. A similar approach can be found in the set of provision aiming at broadening the use of symmetric access obligation in all cases where replication is inefficient or let's say unfeasible, Article 61. Here we find again a meaningful balance between the prescription of the code and the NRA's margin of evaluation. Furthermore, co-investment and symmetric obligation regimes are both subject to similar procedural rules, granting NRA a fairly coordinated approach to the pursuit of internal market competitiveness. I also recall the provision of BEREC guidelines aiming at identifying specific implementing detail, as well as the stricter Commission scrutiny, potentially leading to a veto, again with the collective involvement of NRA by means of the so-called double lock system, envisaged by Article 33. And last but not least, let me underline the special treatment granted to SMP operators acting only at the wholesale level by Article 80, as one of the provisions aiming at promoting investment in the fixed access segments. Obviously, NRAs are called to make the system work in practice. It is not just a matter of norms. In this respect, while confirming my positive judgment of the measures introduced by the code to promote VHCN connectivity, I am convinced that NRA are called to make their best so that the regulatory objective at the heart of the code do not conflict with with each other, and that the pro-competitive EU legislative approach and its targeted application would still effectively serve the purpose of fostering connectivity in each member state and in the EU as a whole. History so far, and the Italian experience in particular, has shown that an effective and sustainable competition is a great driver for infrastructural investment. In such a scenario, AGCOM is now examining the voluntary separation proposal of the SMP operator network. After receiving the proposal, AGCOM carried out a preliminary analysis aimed at verifying, as required by the BEREC guidelines on functional separation, the reliability and the seriousness of the separation project itself, as well as the potential suitability to improve competition. As a result of these assessments, AGCOM Council considered the draft eligible for further examination in the context of coordinated analysis of the access market, also having an ad hoc public consultation in order to acquire market assessment on the project itself, and thus ensure the widest participation of stakeholders. An in-depth evaluation of the related investment project will be also assured in a separate and parallel proceeding AGCOM is going to start, to open very soon. I cannot obviously deal with the merits of these proceedings, but looking ahead, I can just reassure that AGCOM and all NRAs are ready to play their role in the pursuit of the new regulatory goals set by the Code of Electronic Communication. However, ex-ante regulation of fixed access networks is just a part of the full picture, and any regulatory intervention can have a real impact only if joined by other intervention in the whole digital ecosystem and beyond. Complementary mechanisms need to be considered to promote investment in VHCM, such as sector-specific demand-side measures, network deployment by non-telecom utilities, coverage obligation in spectrum options, and so on. Looking at the divide that characterizes some areas of our country, the role of the state aid regime should also be valued, aiming at universal coverage of high-capacity networks in market failure areas. Consistency between sectorial regulation and the state aid framework could be pursued through a recognition of the NRA's role in the state aid context in order to maximize the effectiveness of public intervention. Finally, also the role of the universal service should be considered according to the provision of the code to ensure the availability of all of basic connectivities of a certain quality. Before concluding, let me spend one last word on the institutional layout of the electronic communication sector. Another key regulatory feature addressed by Nicita and Manganelli's analysis, and I believe that it is fundamental to preserve and even reinforce the independent features of the current governance model in electronic communication, to ensure the effective functioning of NRAs and the concrete possibility for them to fully contribute to BEREC's work and to cooperate with the European Commission in a strong, well-founded, multi-level regulatory process. Moreover, I believe that it is also very important that the Commission closely monitors the way the provision of the code are going to be transposed by member states, to make sure that all NRAs are equipped with appropriate resources, as well as with a wide and consistent set of competencies, in order to maximize the effectiveness of BEREC in promoting good regulatory practices in the Union and in all the areas covered by the sectorial framework. I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to following the next intervention within the panel's debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Lasorella, for your intervention that confirms that AGCOM is fully aware of its role, and I'm sure will provide a concrete contribution to the work process in this new challenging and rapidly changing environment. I wish you good work. On this regards, before presenting the next speaker, allow me 2 minutes to give you the last but not least reason why it's important for the Italian chapter, this event today. As you all know, We are here also thanks to this new book entitled, of course, The Governance of Telecom Markets, authored by two friends, Antonio Manganelli and Antonio Nicita, but more important, two well-known economists in the area of law and economics, regulation, and even more, given this occasion, IIC members very active with the Italian chapter. So, I mean, that's a good reason also to be here today. But regarding the book, which I really appreciated, I want just to remind two topics which are not part of the debate today, but nonetheless, I really much appreciate it also because are very dear to me and to my interests. The first one is what I would call like a change of paradigm, which means the shift from sector-specific regulation, vertical regulation, to horizontal regulation. See the last EU package, DSA, DMA, etc., where we are talking about these days. This is not the case of the EEC code and the other sector-specific directives, especially on electronic communication service, audiovisual media services, and information society service, each of them which is its own directive. But if you go to page 157, you can read this. This distinction regarding the three types of service and the related bodies of rules was quite relevant when it was originally introduced. However, nowadays, it doesn't seem to address the current market dynamics. For example, the substitutability between digital service and the overlapping of those categories. Migration to all IP networks that certainly decouple service from transmission make it possible for service application and content to flow seamlessly across networks, thus fundamentally changing the markets. The first effect was to push the telecom industry as well as media and information technology sector towards a multimedia convergence, allowing both traditional and new communication services, whether voice, data, sound, or video, to be provided simultaneously over many different networks and often received with the same multimedia device. As a consequence, telecom operators, I'm still quoting, started to commercialize a much broader variety of services. The provision of fixed and mobile communication and visual media services, multi-play offer are today widespread, along with other innovative value-added information service society development at the edge of the communication system. Some of them, I think this is what we call convergence, and convergence finally happened, and also the regulation should now work on this new bet for the future. And of course, this is a sort of topics that where I've spent quite a lot of time of my professional life, and so I was very happy to read in this book. The second aspect I will not comment, but I found very interesting is the issue of the ex-ante regulation and the interplay between competition and regulation in a time of profound changes. You can read all this from page 57. And I am sure that you can get from these ideas, stimuli, and the right incentive to think and elaborate on these very central topics international debate now. Therefore, I strongly suggest to read this book. I truly hope I will have the chance to talk more in details on this particular aspect if and when we will have another opportunity to discuss on it. But now it's time to pass to Lynn Robinson, our Director General. 1 year from now, more or less, in a very difficult time, she became our director, trying to drive the IIC ship in the storming sea of the pandemic. She did a great job, honestly. So while my work is now concluded and I become part of the audience, I thank you again to be here and the passion to stay here and hear me. And without any more delay, I pass the torch to Lynn. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. A complex aspect of liberalisation in a technological and an investment-intensive market, such as the telecom industry, has always been the relationship between the goal of nurturing competition and the need to ensure incentives for innovation and investments. The policy debate on this topic has been rather intense, and it is ongoing. The EU regulatory framework focused on opening national telecom markets for the transition from a monopolistic to a competitive regime, promoting infrastructure-based competition. Technological innovation, and namely the next generation networks in optic fibre and the consequent development of ultra-broadband digital services, began changing the economic business policy scenario of the telecom market. Consequently, the public policy debate began to gradually focus on industrial policy issues, such as the transition from copper to fibre and the extensive development of future-proof technological assets, rather than solely on the regulation of market failures. The EU and the member states progressively designed industrial policies for NGAN investments by setting increasingly ambitious connectivity and broadband targets. At the European level, these industrial policies have been raised from the challenging yet achievable goals established within the 2010 Digital Agenda for Europe to the extremely ambitious objectives within the 2016 Gigabyte Society. In order to pursue such highly ambitious objectives and address their challenges, new policy and regulatory approaches were developed. Policy objectives in the Digital Agenda for Europe and Gigabyte Society have been at the basis of legislative evolution, i.e. the EECC, both in terms of objectives and specific provisions. Moreover, targets also influence the implementation of state aid rules by means of updating the sector-specific guidelines reflecting the policy objectives. Accordingly, the development of fibre networks, or more generally very high capacity networks, as defined by the EECC, has become one of the main objectives of the telecom regulatory framework, and specific provisions in the new EU code, e.g. co-investments and infrastructure sharing, are aimed to incentivise investments. Whether this indicates a new balance within the competition promotion objective is an open and debated question, and this will feed into the forthcoming debate. The EECC provides new tools for both national regulators and companies. To support this, the Commission has a supervisory role, and BEREC has developed and published guidelines to work towards a successful implementation of the new rules. The deadline for transposing the code into national legislation was the 21st of December 2020. There have been delays across the EU with transposing this code into national legislation, and of course the pandemic hasn't helped the situation. Our speakers today will share their perspectives on how the EECC will impact the balance between competition safeguards and investment incentives, and the progress to date with the implementation. I would now like to hand over to the chair of today's panel, Professor Manganelli. Over to you.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the opening words. Thank you very much, Augusto, Lynn, and Presidente La Sorella, for the very kind opening words and interesting presentation, introduction, really full of insights, both on the Italian situation, but also on the overall European situation and approach. I will share a presentation, and also in order to have to give some initial remarks, and also to introduce of course the panel discussion that I will be coordinating. So the panel will be composed of very distinguished speakers, and I'm very anxious of hearing their presentation and their position, and mainly their interaction about the topic. So Professor Martin Cave, chair of Ofgem, the UK energy regulator, and professor of economics at London School of Economics, but also many other things. I remember also is an inquiry chair in the CMA, the Competition Markets Authority, where I have opportunity to work with him in some projects, and it was very interesting for me, of course. Then we'll have Professor Alexander Destrel, who is professor of EU law at the University of Namur and academic co-director at CERRE, and also in the scientific committee of the Foreign School of Regulation, where both of us really left a piece of the heart, maybe. And so I will also take the chance to say hi to Pierluigi Parcu. And we'll have then Dr. Camilla Klock, who is head of unit and market unit at DG Connect of the European Commission, and Dr. Annegret Grebel, who is head of international affairs at BNETC and co-chair of the BEREC Remedies expert working group. So then we'll have a question and answer section, which could be quite dynamic, because I will just start to coordinate the panel with a question to each of the panelists, and then we'll start a discussion among us, and also injecting some questions from the audience. And then we'll have closing remarks from Professor Antonio Nicita, who is professor of economic policy at LUMSA University, and also, as said, is a former member of the board of Agicom, the Italian regulator. Starting just for a very few words introduction. So the telecom industry is, of course, a very capital intensive and innovative technological sector. So when we talk about the relationship between competition and investment, which is the main topic of the panel, of course, we have different scenarios in different industries, depending whether the sunk cost for building the network have been already sustained. And for example, we can develop competition in the market, just developing access-based competition, so having competitors entering in the market and paying the cost of access to the network already developed, differently from a scenario where new networks or very innovative investment has to be done. And in such a dynamic framework, of course, which could, if it's relevant for the social welfare, the overall effect of access competition is not so clear-cut. I mean, there could be some trade-off. And in fact, some of the two of the very well-known industrial economists, especially at the time, Jean Tirole and Jacques Lafonte, who wrote that book on competition and telecommunications, which is very well known by competition economists and the economists dealing with telecom sector. They said that there is a general trade-off between promoting competition to increase social welfare once the infrastructure is in place, and encouraging the incumbent to invest and maintain the infrastructure. So this approach, this trade-off, really lead us, and the theory and the theoretical thinking that has been developed during these years, to the very well-known, let's say, confrontation of Joseph Schumpeter's position with Kenneth Arrow. Just in a very nutshell, Schumpeter said that thought that in monopoly, a firm with significant market power has bigger incentive and ability to innovate than firms facing competition in the market. Basically for two reasons. First, for the greater ability to appropriate benefits stemming from technological breakouts by excluding potential competitors, and also because usually they have deeper pockets, so a higher financial capacity to make big investment and innovation. Therefore, Schumpeter's position underlies those positions and that trade-off between competition and innovation. On the other side, Kenneth Arrow stressed how a monopolistic firm has less to gain from innovation because it faces opportunity costs that a firm in a competitive market does not bear. Essentially, the risk of losing its existing pre-innovation monopoly profits. That's so-called replacement effect. However, Arrow also highlighted and described the appropriability problem that reduces anyway the incentive for companies to innovate in a perfectly competitive market. But that seems to this position to be completely unsolvable, opposed. But is it really so? Maybe not. Maybe not, because there is also some in-between approach that have been highlighted mainly by empirical study, highlighting the existence of a non-linear relationship or inverted U relationship between competition and innovation. So in that way, that both very low and very high levels of competition would reduce incentive to invest, and the point of maximum could be linked to an intermediate level of intensity or type of competition, which is something that is really important for the telecom sector. And in fact, in point of fact, the views of Schumpeter-Arrow are not necessarily conflicting, because Schumpeter itself described the cyclical relationship between competition and monopoly, where in a nutshell, they represent two sides of the same coin. So on one side, competition provides firms with the right incentive to innovate, while differentiating services and products in an effort to obtain those monopolistic revenues. And monopoly, on the other hand, attracts new competitor, driven by desire to erode away a part of those monopolistic rents. So the point here is to see how competition and investment is introduced in a regulatory environment. So what are the take home point from what I said before? The fact that competition has to be considered in its intensity or type of competition. And so, as we will see, is service-based competition or versus facility-based competition or infrastructure-based competition. And also time has to be considered as the cyclical approach of Schumpeter and reconciled with the approach of Arrow. So in terms of regulation, and the regulatory thinking, this developed at the beginning of the regulatory framework, the concept of service-based competition vis-a-vis with infrastructure-based competition, and the ladder of investment theory and its regulatory approach, regulatory use as a way to reconcile, to use time to reconcile, let's say, the short-term benefit of competition with the longer-term benefit of innovation, making, in a way, service-based competition, infrastructure-based competition work as a complement. And that's an approach which was really developed and deepened by Professor Martin Cave. We have, of course, here today, as I said, and we will ask him to give us some more insights about it, and basically with the handbook on telecommunication economics that he co-authored in 2002 and 2005, and quite a few, I mean, I mentioned only 3 of them, article published mainly in Telecommunication Policy, where he developed the first one, 2003, with Ingo Vogelsang, so how entry and access regulation interact, and then the others dealing with the ladder of investment and its evolution. So I will ask as a first question to Martin about his ladder of investment theory and its regulatory use, and ask him also whether there were some theoretical pitfalls in this theory or in the use, and there were some empirical problems it encountered in this approach encountered, affecting the expected outcome. So I will give the floor to Martin to answer these first questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. I'm delighted to be invited to Rome, even if only virtually, remotely, but still it enables me to dream of being there in some slightly more corporeal sense in the summer to come. I'm going to begin by taking you into a kind of by way of economic history when the ladder investment emerged, this was about 20 years ago, before we even had smartphones. So many of you will probably find it very difficult to remember these remote events. And it arose in conjunction with the development of the 2003 directives, which was happening at the time. And as you know, those directives had a strong focus upon competition and consumer protection. Competition was thus seen as being the end state for the sector, which was very helpful. Access regulation was only permissible with finding a significant market power. And perhaps equally importantly, there were sunset clauses of the access regulation, which meant that they were constantly under review. And so the issue came how actually to operationalize regulation with those objectives, and the starting point normally of complete domination of fixed telecommunications market by the historic monopolist or something akin to that. Some cable activity as well, but in telecoms more narrowly construed, a very strong market position by the incumbent. And so the painfully simple idea in the ladder investment was that recognizing that you couldn't persuade entry across all the components of the value chain, which differed considerably in the investments which were required, you could actually break down the value chain and then order the separate components in the ease of entry, in the ease of replicability. And then once you did that, you could focus particularly upon encouraging entrance in the bits of the value chain which are easiest to entry. And then once a foothold had been established by a number of firms in that activity, then you might move on to the next activity where replication was perhaps a little bit harder. And then finally, the process would come to an end. I'll discuss in a moment the limitations on the extent to which it could finally go. And so that the very simple ranking that emerged from the people who were developing and trying to apply this particular approach was that retail was the easiest to replicate, fairly straightforward. Then it was core networks. Then it was the electronics and the exchange. But in that time, there was very little prospect of replicating the copper loop, just simply because in the first years of this century, nobody was daft enough to invest in a copper loop when everybody knew that fiber was going to be the next best thing. And then on top of that, you could proceed in various other ways to encourage entrants to climb the ladder and take over more activities themselves and rely less upon the incumbent. And you could basically do it in one of two ways. Either you could just simply withdraw the access product, so they had to move, otherwise they couldn't continue to exist in the marketplace. Or alternatively, you could flex the access prices. So initially, you might offer entrants quite a substantial discount just simply for reselling the incumbent's services. But then you could reduce that margin and then encourage them by offering quite a good price on the next access product, which I suppose would be Bitstream. That's to say that would encourage them to build their own core networks. And then you could encourage them to put their electronics in the exchange by offering a good regulatory price on the unbundled local loop. And on that footing, they would see an opportunity to move up, and they might actually move up. So this worked. I must confess, it worked much better than I suspect many people expected, because quite a lot of entry occurred. And secondly, it started out largely with the very expansive access products, in which the entrant did very little and the incumbent did almost everything. And then the access products became more and more restricted, until finally about 3/4 of the customers of the competitors were served only using the unbundled copper loops of the incumbent. So it was an indication of how this thing might work. But then fiber came along, and as many of you will remember, there was a fairly lengthy debate about the nature of the European Commission's approach to the regulation of fiber, with various drafts of the relevant recommendation. And partly as a result of certain delays in clarifying what the recommendation was, member states took different approaches. And to put it very, very crudely, two approaches came about. In some member states, the regulator persisted with the ladder of investment approach and then considered what access product should be the principal access product available to competitors. And they decided that that access product should in fact just be the infrastructure, the ducts and poles necessary to convey a competing fiber to the homes of the relevant consumers. So in other words, it was an approach which was based upon going up another rung of the ladder and reducing still further the dependence of the competitor upon the incumbent, and taking possibly competing fibers to the home. And this permitted a kind of investment race between the incumbent and the entrants, because in providing fiber to the home service, the incumbent didn't have any sunk costs in fiber assets. It had to invest at the same time. And the two were placed on an even footing. So that was one approach. The other approach was to prefer or allow the incorporation of fiber in the network to a more limited extent by the means of fiber to the node using VDSL, and mandating a suitable access product for that purpose, which in some countries, including the UK, became a kind of fiber bit stream, which actually represented, so to speak, a step down the ladder in the opposite direction. Now, fiber to the node grew very quickly. It was very cheap. Fiber to the home grew much more slowly. It was perhaps 4 or 5 times as expensive to do. And so unsurprisingly, the advantage appeared superficially to rest first with those proponents of fiber to the node. However, subsequently, as the juggernaut of competing fiber to the home gained strength, and 2 or 3 fiber competitors in many countries were offering their services, the situation, in my view, it was suggesting that the fiber to the home policy was the better one, the more effective one in the long term. I'm reminded perhaps slightly tendentiously of the famous fable by Aesop of the race between the hare and the tortoise. As you remember, these two animals agreed to have a race, and the hare went off very quickly and was very confident of victory. In fact, so confident that it fell asleep, and then that the tortoise came along and actually got over the winning line first. And this is perhaps slightly tendentious, but possibly a similar thing happened in this, that those who appeared at first to be the tortoise may actually have won the race. And I think this is very important, because if you have taken the fiber to the node route, then you may find yourself in quite a tricky position if it subsequently becomes a fervent aim of government policy, as it is in the UK, for example, to have ubiquitous availability of fiber to the home. Because what's happened in the meantime is that the fiber to the home then has to compete with ubiquitous fiber to the node, which is a very good product capable of satisfying many people's needs for connectivity. Secondly, you may find, as has happened in the UK, that some locations for fiber to the home, the most prosperous ones, may have been cherry-picked by alternative networks, which makes the whole investment project for the dominant and strengthened former historic monopolist slightly more difficult. And what you've done inadvertently, perhaps, is you may have strengthened the historic monopolist. Now, those reflections are based entirely upon UK experience. I'd be very interested as the discussion develops to hear about what's happened in other member states of the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was very interesting, of course, and gave us a a lot of food for thoughts. And as you said, of course, there are different situations in different European countries. Actually, the situation is quite heterogeneous, and that's one of the main problem, of course, of the telecom regulation. That's why also one of the main feature of the EU telecom regulation is the decentralization. So at the end, there are the national regulatory authority who implement and also decide that the balance between the different objectives in the framework and how to pursue them. Of course, there are coordination mechanisms, both at vertical coordination mechanism with the European Commission, and also horizontal, so involving BEREC. Then we will see this perspective later when asking to Annegret and Camilla to talk. But now I would like to give the floor to Alex Destree, because of course this very interesting overview by Martin gave us the condition to comment and to understand, and also to elaborate on how and why the different the framework evolution implied an evolution of the objectives of the regulatory activity, and mainly the balance of these objectives. Of course, as we know that the main framework we are referring to is the so-called new regulatory framework at that time, 2002 framework, which was new at the time, not so much anymore, but still is nice to, according to me, it's nice to call it new, because it was really a milestone in the regulatory approach. Really, there was a changing of approach from the previous approach. And then the revision 2009, and also the recommendation and the directive that were taking place, the next generation access recommendation and the cost accounting directive. And finally, with the new European Electronic Communication Code, the directive in 2018. So I will ask Alex to elaborate on the regulatory objectives and how these were influenced or are influencing the market dynamic, the policy objective at European level, and the level of investment.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. So really, yes, what I would like to focus on is this new objective of investment, which is more explicit, and it has been already recalled by President Lasorella, and how it can play out in what the regulator are doing now. Now, the short answer could be that everyone should read chapter 6 of your book, because I think everything is very well explained and in a very pedagogical way. So I really recommend this book for at least 3 qualities. It's short. It is really dealing with the main issue. So because, you know, when I received the book, I said, that's a bit short. I mean, I don't know how they can deal with all the big issue in such, but they managed to do it. That's quite remarkable. And it's also very clear, really, it's super pedagogical. So I really commend this book and recommend everyone who is listening to us to look at that book. And it was not paid ranking, I can reassure everyone. I see it in my full academic independence. Now, going to your question, and I think this is one thing you explained very well in the chapter, is that regulation, and it has also been recalled, I think, very well by the president. This objective of investment, regulation is only one driver, and I would say even not the main driver for investment. We have a lot of other factors which influence the investment, and the first one, I think, is the demand. You know, and there, of course, for the European Union, it may be a problem because the EU doesn't have much competence, legal competence, to deal with demand issue, like, for instance, digital skills or digital government or consumer equipment. So clearly, I mean, there is a bias in the EU regulation towards supply side because there is a bias in the competence. No, the good news, if there is one good news with the COVID, there are not many, but there is at least one, is that it has helped, it has pushed the demand a lot. That's obvious. That's obvious because the consumption of digital technologies in general has increased. I saw some numbers which says that, you know, the demand has increased in 1 year what was expected to be only for 5 years. So we have in a way won 4 years. So that's the first thing, and then the second thing is in terms of the EU Next Generation Fund, you know, which is also a consequence of the COVID, you know, the different fund that the member states will receive from the EU. As we all know, 20% should be dedicated to digital, but that could be a demand aspect of digital because it will be spent by the member states and not decided by the EU. So I think on this demand aspect, which is key, as you say in your book, we may have some hope. The other factors influencing investment is, of course, the state of the network, which is, you know, what you get from history, whether you have cable or not. You mentioned in your book that there is no cable in Italy, and whether you have ducts or not. Of course, it's easier when you have ducts to fiber the country than when you don't. Okay. Another element is obviously the geography and the population density and the country. So, you know, we have a lot of factors, and I think it's important to remember that besides regulation. But now, if we then go to regulation as such, I think what you show in your book, and I think it's a good insight, I think, is that regulators have always pushed investment. I mean, it's not new, and it's not with the framework that this objective has appeared. And Martin mentioned that before as well. But let's say the goal before was to get to infrastructure-based competition through the ladder of investment. Okay. And that was really why the objective of investment was to create more competition. While now I think we have a broader concern, if I may say so, is that, I mean, we need very high capacity network for all the rest of the society. So it's not just an issue of competition, but it's also an issue of broader societal needs. And so, as again you explain also in your book, the role of the regulator, more than before, will be to do industrial policy and not just competition. Now, this is something we may discuss, but I tend to agree, if I have understood well what you say in your book, it's a more obvious industrial policy role than before. Now, my take is that a regulator has always done some industrial policy. But, you know, 20 years ago, we could not say that. You know, I mean, in Brussels, at least, because everybody was identifying industrial policy with the French Colbertisme, which was seen as a failure, which is in fact not so much sometimes, but okay. But no, I mean, this industrial policy come back, and you have even a French commissioner in charge, which is quite remarkable. Have a French commissioner in charge of industrial policy. I think 20 years ago it would not have been possible. And so yes, I mean the job of the regulator will probably be more difficult, even more difficult than before, because you have this additional element of industrial policy. Now, the good thing is that the NRA have more tools to do that, and again that was recalled by President Lasorella, is that there is indeed more tool in the toolbox of the NRA. Co-investment, wholesale only, symmetric obligation, and here I like very much one of the tables that you do in your book that is showing this pedagogical aspect of the book, because you show, you know, how all those different, let's say, new tools can play out and compare to each other. But I still see two risks with this enlargement of the toolbox, and I will close with that. The first one is that because the toolbox is larger, the possibility of divergences across member states is larger as well, because I mean, as the toolbox is larger, you can use the possibility of using different tool is possible. Now, I don't think it's a problem. I mean, it may be a risk, but and you may say, okay, it's a problem for harmonization, but I don't think it's a problem because telecom infrastructure is mostly a local good at the end of the day. So it's very different from the discussion we have for digital platform and the discussion we have now in the DMA, the Digital Markets Act, where we say, okay, it should be the commission in charge. And it makes perfect sense there because we are talking about a global platform. But I mean, telecom infrastructure is still very local. So I don't see any problem of having different view. And if anything, it can also be an advantage because as Martin was saying, you know, different countries have taken different routes because, as Martin was recalling, the Commission was a bit late with its harmonization recommendation. But at the end of the day, you know, maybe it was a good result because let's suppose that the recommendation would have taken the other route. It would not have been good, and we would not have those two animals to compare, or we could have taken, Martin, another comparison, more biblical comparison, you know, that the first will be the last, and vice versa. So, you know, I think this risk of more experimentation, you could say, is probably not necessarily an issue. The other risk I see is that we have more possibility for the regulator. The toolbox has been enlarged, but at the same time, my impression, but we will have some regulator later and she could confirm or not at all, but my impression is that the constraint on the regulator have not been increased as much as the possibility, okay? And so my concern is that we may have a higher risk of regulatory creep or a type 2 error because you have more possibility, but you don't have more constraint. No, let's be clear. My point is not to say that the telecom regulator are not constrained. They are, of course. They are, of course. There is a lot of constraint in the code and before. But I mean, I think that I sense at least a risk of regulatory creep with those new tools, and or that those new tools will not be used to the right extent. So, I mean, again, I mean, I don't see that this is what we see now, but I fear that there is maybe an issue that we wanted to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Very, very interesting and very clear as always. And thank you very much for referring to our book. And actually, it was our purpose to be very succinct because I mean there are a lot of very big books, and as you said, it was not easy to put everything in a small book, but I hope we managed. And thank you very much for intervention. Very, very full of the insights. And of course, you referred to the new instrument. You referred to the industrial policy versus let's say addressing market failure as the role of the regulator. And I'm sure someone following us, and I will give the floor, will be not so much in line with that, but we will understand an opinion. And of course, there is, as I said, it's very true that the fact that the toolbox has enlarged, there is the possibility of some less intense harmonization, and that's of course. I mean, the differences, depending on the differences of peculiarities of national markets, of course, is something that is enshrined. I mean, is endogenous in the code. But at the end, an harmonization must be in place because it's one of the objectives of the framework, and the Commission is there also for that. And we will ask to Camilla what is opinion in this regard. But now I will give the floor, as the regulators were mentioned very often. I will give the floor to Annegret Grebel, and of course she's in the double role of national regulator and also the co-chair of the BEREC-ESPER working group. And I will ask her what is the perception from NRA about the new code, the new the new toolbox and maybe new more freedom of action. And on the other side, what also is the role of BEREC, because of course having more toolbox also, what there is in the code is also an increased role of BEREC as a horizontal coordination rather than only a vertical coordination with the Commission. So Annegret, it's the floor is yours.
Yes, thanks a lot, and pleasure to be in this interesting panel and to really have very different aspects to see. And let me try to also tackle the issue from a regulator's point of view, and of course also from BEREC, and because I'm there, the co-chair of the remedies working group, and I also focus in my presentation a little bit on these aspects. I think picking up what you just said, I certainly agree. Given that there's also a new instrument for BEREC, the BEREC guidelines, I think there is a bigger role for BEREC to play. And so let me show you the first slide. Here we are. And what I would like to touch upon a little bit is the question, are we moving away from the very clear-cut concept that was in since the 2002 framework of a principle-based regulation based on competition law principles, and regulators having the power then to choose the most appropriate and proportionate remedy, towards something that I call here micromanagement. And as you see here, I have tried to capture in this little diagram a little bit all the soft law aspects, and of course also the aspect of having a broader toolbox. Now, yes, it was said a lot of times today, there are, let's say, more objectives. In particular, we have the new objective of connectivity. And naturally, as every economist knows, if you have more objectives, you also need more tools. So therefore, I think it is natural that we have a broader toolbox. We now also have the symmetric regulation. And we have the SMP regulation with an additional tools there as well. So I think that is reflecting the general approach here. I don't think that let's say this is already industrial policy, or that regulators do industrial policy, as Alexandra was saying, also way back in 2002. I think the clear approach is a pro-competitive approach, and I think what is necessary from a regulator's perspective is clearly that we still pursue this pro-competitive approach, which in my view is not in contradiction with the additional objectives if correctly applied. What I think the only risk I see, by definition, I don't see a regulatory risk, but I think there is one conceptually maybe a risk, and that is what I call that we have here now a lot of additional soft law. We have the EC recommendations, and I come to them in a minute, as well as the BEREC guidelines. And I think the BEREC guidelines are an important tool to be, let's say, to have this consistent approach that is necessary to promote the internal market. So I agree there, and I don't think that regulators have less constraints there. We have the BEREC guidelines, and of course also for consistent application, the double lock veto for the two new tools, which I think is important to recall. What worries me more is a little bit the fact that we get, or we risk of getting two layers of soft law. Of course, we need the relevant market recommendation. just new, and the S&P guidelines of 2018. And in the future, we will also see the new access recommendation or recommendations. We now still have the NGA recommendation and the NDCM recommendation. They also touch upon something where we now have the guidelines on minimum criteria for reference offer. We have guidelines on co-investment, and you see also that there is the WEC notice regarding the legacy infrastructure, and on the other side, the WEC parameters report of BEREC. So what and for the symmetric regulation on the other side, we have the Article 61.3 guidelines, and on the consistent application there, you even have it in the title of the guidelines of the consistent applications of the symmetric regulation of Article 61.3. I think something which is important is that we have a guidelines on the definition of what is a very high capacity networks, and that certainly is an important new element that BEREC has also the power to define new or the mandate to define exactly what we pursue, because we should not forget the objective here and the definition, the clear-cut definition of the objective. Regarding the connectivity goal as such, there are additionally guidelines on Article 22, the geographical survey on the deployment of broadband infrastructure. And here we also have, and a number of NRAs apply these, the BCRD. And additionally to this, we have recently seen connectivity recommendation. So what I want to point out with this is that we have such a lot of additional soft law, a layer of soft law that the necessary flexibility of NRAs to fine-tune and to tailor-make the regulation, the regulatory obligations, is narrowed down more and more. And we can go to the next slide. Yeah, and this is a bit the same, just a little bit more detailed by articles. And I move on here now, because now I want to, let's say, conclude a little bit on where I see a bit of a risk of these too detailed recommendations, because we see very much detailed and prescriptive recommendations. We at the same time do also have BEREC guidelines now newly. And so if we go together with these, there is a bit of a risk that the original point of the EECC, that NRAs need to take into account to promote competition, long-term end-user interests when looking at promoting the connectivity goal, gets lost or gets buried under all those additional prescriptive tools or prescriptive soft law. We think that this would, let's say, as I said at the very beginning, risk to move away from the clear principle-based and pro-competitive regulatory approach that is also still enshrined in the framework, in the code. We shouldn't forget about this and only look at one of the objectives. Yes, there is a new objective, clearly, and NRAs and BEREC fully agree with this. But it is not the only one. And I think the discussion also today took a bit an approach of the NRAs should only look at promoting connectivity and promoting a particular type of connectivity, losing out of sight the other objectives, and also losing out of sight the underlying conceptual approach that is that by promoting competition, you also promote other objectives, in particular of course the benefit for the end users, but also the investment. Yeah, I think that is, as also the President Lazzarella said, something which goes hand in hand and is not opposed. And in my view, the big risk is indeed that by focusing only on connectivity, and even a specific type of connectivity, we lose out of sight the broader picture, and we also lose out of sight the main drivers and the main concept of the regulatory approach that is enshrined in saying promote competition to also reach the other objectives. So in case we indeed, let's say, limit ourselves or have a shortcut view only on connectivity, we would do industrial policy. But I'm very much convinced that this is not the task of the regulator, and that this is also not the concept that is in the EECC. But the EECC clearly foresees that we have a bundle of objectives which we need to promote equally, and where we should not forget, with our regulatory approach overall, that these are best pursued if we balance the tools in a way that both of the objectives are, or more, all the objectives are reached, the four main objectives that we have. Also, let's say, using the mechanism and the complementarity of the objectives. And I think that is something which is sometimes forgotten by having what I call here a sort of deterministically aspect on focusing on predefining outcomes, rather than having a pro-competitive approach in saying the market, then make the market work, and then the results will follow as intended by using the whole toolbox in a consistent way. But being able to use it also means having the flexibility and the necessary margin of discretion, which we should not bury under too much and too prescriptive additional soft law. I think that is the important message that I want to let's say recall in a way. And we have heard of a lot of economists today, which I think is me as an economist also welcomes very much. So let me refer to one economist that is that, let's say, created a famous German approach of fundamental economic policy and economic principles, and this is what we call ordoliberalism. This is not to be mixed up with neoliberalism, but with ordoliberalism, and there you have the word ordo in it, which means giving a framework and then allowing all players to play in this properly in this framework. By setting a framework, and of course that is the task of the regulator, to use the toolbox. Absolutely agree, but also to use all of the toolbox in a consistent way, and of course consistent also across Europe, to pursue all of the objectives and not to limit oneself only to one of the objectives. I think if we do this, we miss our task and we miss our mandate. And I think that is something where NRAs contribute at the same time to reach the objectives of connectivity via or with promoting competition at the same time by using the whole new toolbox. I think I'll leave it here, and I hope we can discuss about my message. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Annegret. It's very, very interesting as always. and your approach and your words are very clear, and I feel like I mean, supporting some of the statement that you do. Of course, there are more than one objectives in the code. That there is a new one formally, because in some way also was in the previous framework. But of course, all the objectives has to be balanced. There is a very wide range of tool and the standard toolbox. Also, as Alexander said, but all the tools can be used and should be used. For this, of course, the role, as you underlined, the role of BEREC is quite important and increased also from the period in which I used to work there in the BEREC office and working with you as well. So I worked with a lot of person here today, and so that's very good, and I feel like at home in a way. And yes, and so on this basis, of course, it's very important, the dialogue between the European Commission and the regulators, in order, as I said, to keep the harmonization and the role of BEREC, and also something that it's important in the new framework is also the definition of the geographical aspect of regulation, which is something that was, of course, developed by the regulatory authority, and in a way it's a complement also, to go back to Martin's presentation, of the ladder of investment, because as well the geographical differentiation of definition of relevant markets and the declination of regulatory measure in a way is still a way to reconcile competition and investment, and not in a, let's say, diachronic, so temporal way, but in a geographical way. So it's something that we, in the book, we defined that not the ladder of investment, but the chessboard of investment, because having a different geographical development. Of course, the two things are not excluding each other. They are applied at the same time. So, and also in this variety, as I said, it's very important the role and the approach that the Commission will have in its vertical coordination role, which is not only the phase 2 procedures, but it's also, of course, definition of relevant market, the possibility to issue recommendation and also decision that can harmonize the framework. So all this role that the Commission is playing is, of course, crucial. So I will give the floor to Camilla to discuss this.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today, not in Rome, but close enough, thanks to the digital tools and connectivity. Maybe I will start with a bit of more general statement, because I think the discussion today is much broader than per se the focus on the code and the regulatory tools that we have at our disposal. But of course, I will also plan to mention the work that we are doing for the implementation of the code. But I will start maybe because it's additional pleasure to be here today to listen to Martin. I had been studying from your books when I started working on the issues, and when I was doing my PhD about telecommunication in the context of both competition and regulatory tools. So it's been a really pleasure also to listen to you and to be present with you in this conference. And also I have to also very much underline that the book that both Antonios prepared is really, really well drafted. In fact, I recommended it to my colleagues as extremely nicely putting, the main elements. Now back to the subject. I think, inspired by what Martin said, I a little bit changed the structure of my presentation. So I would like to a little bit start where we are coming from, because de facto we are now 30 years since the start of the liberalization, and the code, the way we design it, is very much focusing on this final stage, next stage of what will happen with telecoms. What we had seen through the years, and Martin described it extremely well, is for sure shift more from the monopoly to competition. The question is where we will be at the end of this road and where we will be in 2030. We are trying to answer this question now in the Commission, and we are preparing the digital decade communication and looking into the role of connectivity in particular for this vision of the future and where Europe should be in this regard. And we have seen a lot of changes. Me, in my current role, when we are analyzing decisions coming from regulatory authorities in terms of the regulation of markets, I see incredible shift even within the last 2 years. We started from many decisions which are very much focused on national markets, on imposing regulation on telecom operators across the range of the tools that are possible. And we've been shifting with many of the decisions proposed by regulators more and more towards very much regulatory focused decisions, looking at the geographic markets, looking very deeply into the local market. And this is where we should look at the end of the day, because the monopoly in this sector, if it's defined somewhere, it is local. So this is where we need to refocus our attention. Where we will be in 10 years from now, so 40 years after the start of the liberalization process, I think it's very difficult for us to say now. Will it be full competition? Probably not, because we are also facing the natural monopoly in many of the aspects. But what we for sure had witnessed through this, I think even the last decade, is really, really constant shift. We have seen, apart from the, of course, huge competition coming from the fiber operators, we had also seen the role of cable, which is increasing in many of the member states. It's also changing the way regulators are regulating these markets. That adds to the complexity as well of the work to be done by regulators. Now, going back to the objectives of the code in this context, I think this is one of the things that I fully agree with Annegret, with what she said before. I usually agree more with Annegret than on other aspects, as she knows very well. But on the objectives, yes, I really strongly believe that the next decade and what we provided in the code in terms of the objectives is the right framework and the right principles. And indeed, I also can fully subscribe that promotion of connectivity and very high capacity networks, yes, it's very important provision, and for sure it will be very strongly enforced by regulators, but not only by regulators. Please remember that regulation cannot do all the tricks in terms of promotion of very high capacity networks. But what I really also believe that competition, internal market, and end user, which was a little bit missed in some of our of the previous interventions, is also equally important. Please also pay attention that the code is not giving the priority for neither of them. And starting with internal market, this is a bit trying to respond to what Annegret was saying in the context of potential micromanagement or over-prescription by the Commission of different tools, to which I will also come back. Internal market is very important precondition for the connectivity, for the goals that we have in the code. That also means that certain elements of fragmentation needs to be addressed. One of them, which is not really discussed here today, is, for example, spectrum management. So in that sense, I tend to disagree that by the code, what we propose in the code, what co-legislators agreed, and by the fact that there are certain harmonization tasks as well envisaged in the code, like for BEREC to provide guidelines on co-investment or symmetrical, like for us to issue certain recommendations, we are over-regulating and overdoing it. No, internal market and tackling fragmentation as well is one of the goals that we are all trying to pursue. Now talking about main elements, I was expecting that Annegret will cover very much the achievements of the BEREC, which are indeed not easy guidelines on co-investment. It had been, as you know, very, very difficult and highly negotiated article of the code. It became quite complex. But I think it also, we got all the balances there probably right. Let's hope and let's see how it would be implemented in practice, and we'll be watching very closely, replying to some of the questions in the chat. So these are really very important tools that will guide regulators in the assessment of the proposals that will be coming from the SMP operators in that context. Second thing, we have, of course, guidelines on symmetrical. There is, of course, very interesting discussion that is ongoing right now about the priority of the rules, how much the SMP traditional regulation versus symmetrical regulation, how the balance should be placed. Both are in the toolbox, both are in the code. So this is also something that we have to take into account, and we'll be providing as well, maybe not another guidelines, but we'll be providing our advice through also the decision-making process and our comments on the decisions by NRAs. Annegret mentioned several elements that were adopted because of the code. First of all, many of these elements that Annegret mentioned of the soft law were envisaged in the code, starting with delegated act on termination rates. This is typical harmonization measure that was explicitly requested by co-legislators and had been delivered within the timeline that was envisaged in the code. The recommendation on the relevant markets. Here I want just to say a few words because I think it's also very interesting recommendation, recognizing a lot of the trends that have been discussed as well here. First of all, this recommendation was also envisaged by the code and were explicitly asked to deliver it by December last year, in particular, in order to guide the work of regulators in this respect. This recommendation is very much recognizing what we had already seen in the decisions of regulators, which is basically focused regulation, very much focused regulation, which is focusing on markets where really regulation is still needed. I'm talking about SMP type of regulation. That's why we proposed also to reduce the number of regulated markets from 5, taking out termination markets, because the price regulation very much was taken over by the delegated act, but also taking out the central wholesale access market, which is also very interesting from the point of view of what Martin was saying about the letter of investment in this context, because indeed we had made this decision based on the fact that there is a competition pressure, there is a change in this market, and we thought we need also to push a bit access seekers towards the local wholesale market, which is the sustainment on the list. There was also a very interesting element in the, and I think it's also interesting for the discussion that we had in the recommendation of relevant markets, because we put a lot of attention to possibility to have a separate physical infrastructure access market. Martin mentioned the Ofcom decision. We had been analyzing this one because it was still in the time when we were analyzing British notifications. We found this concept very interesting, but because the situation in the member states differs. We don't have everywhere the ubiquitous DAX. We don't have everywhere possibility to use this DAX. We decided that at this stage we will not recommend, will not push operators to this last element of the infrastructure that can be accessed. However, we very much recommend the approach which is in the code, which is to prescribe in first place access to DAX in the context of regulation of other markets. And this is also, I think, quite important shift change. It's not the change from the code. We are very much in line with the code, whatever we are doing with different recommendations. But I think it's also a very important element from this recommendation. And last but not least, because Annegret mentioned it, yes, indeed, we are now working on access recommendation, on reviewing the existing access recommendations. But here I have to admit that I disagree with Annegret and Berek in that context, because I really think that some certain elements of the existing recommendations are simply not applicable anymore. And this is something we also have to address. The code also changed the landscape. The regulators are using different tools. The recommendations, the old recommendations cannot, block the use of these different tools. And to some extent, as they stand now, in particular, NGA recommendations probably are not fit for the purpose. We have to look how to move the the anchor? Is it still at the level of copper? Are we not moving towards fiber? So there are a lot of questions that we are trying to answer with the work on this very, very interesting recommendation. I can promise, Annegret, that we will very closely look into the evidence from the member states, what regulators are doing, what regulators are recommending, and will be very open in this process. However, I really do see the need for a review of the access recommendations, and I think it would also might provide more simplicity, because we'll also reduce from 2 to 1 of the soft tools that Annegret mentioned on the long list. So I will finish now, because I think we are also very much pressed with time, but I'm happy to reply to questions.
Thank you very much, Camilla. Very, very interesting, of course, and the perspective from the Commission, complementing the one from regulators and BEREC, and of course also the different perspective are part of the dialogue and the composition of the interest between all the parties in the European framework. And I will there are 20 minutes left, so I will just focus on a couple of questions that we received from the audience, try to interpret them in a more wide way. One is about recurring, having at least 3 of them concerning the delay in the transposition of the code into the national legislation, which of course, as recalled, it could be in a way also caused by the problems that some policymakers at national level had into passing new laws in this complex period. But on the other side, should be highlighted that the code is really would give national regulators really useful tools also for addressing this particularly problematic period. So of course should be interest of everybody, of course the Commission, national regulators also as advocating national legislator for really transposing in time. Not in time is not anymore possible, but transposing as soon as possible the provision, and also for national legislators should be clear that the new code is giving new tools, and it's very useful also for addressing some of the problems that you are facing. Other question could concern with the co-investment, which is of course something that it's a very interesting new tool between the others that the code introduced, that also Camilla mentioned about the dialogue and the confrontation between defining the provision and then the BEREC guidelines, the guidelines about it. Of course, I would start from this last question, because maybe it gives the opportunity to more people to intervene, because it's quite an interesting thing. And I would start just in just 1 second, sharing this one slide, because this is one of the I don't know if you see this, one of the nice things that it's in the book that I really like, the fact that basically the taxonomy that we built, starting from the ladder of investment, so from service-based competition to facility-based competition, where there were just coupling between separation of the competitors, vertical structure of competitors, with the type of competition. So vertically separated competitors of the incumbent develop service-based competition, accessing the network, and then climbing the ladder of investment toward facility-based competition, where, of course, at the same time, the vertical structure of the competitors progressively change from separation to integration. So they become progressively integrated. So that's quadrant 1 and 2. It's, let's say, traditional ladder of investment. And some of the new tools which are included in the code extend also the scope. like decoupling service-based competition with integration, separation, and facility-based competition. So what is also relevant is the dynamic at upstream, we'll say, level. So cooperation on one side, so the co-investment of infrastructure sharing, and competition at upstream level on the other side. I know that the wholesale-only model is more important in some countries, more developed in some countries than in other, but still I think it's anyway an very interesting issue to debate also at European level in general, because it's a new novelty from the code, and it's quite interesting. And it's something we highlight in the book. It is, in a way, you see this arrow on the ladder of investment, and then it can deviate at a certain point. So the co-investment is a kind of cooperative evolution of the ladder of investment. So it's based on the same basis of the fact that competitors would compete and then progressively invest and being infrastructure, and at the same point where investment either from competitors, by competitors or the incumbent, is not feasible because of the risk, because of the cost, the co-investment could jump in a way to have a cooperative evolution of the ladder of investment, and so the co-investment provision. On the other side, quadrant 3, the wholesale only model is kind of a different model. I mean, which can, according how it's developed, can complement the ladder of investment, for example, fill in the gap where there are no investment in white areas, but also in some countries, there is in Italy very much there is some overlapping, of course, of the two model. This, of course, it's a different way of what Alex referred of infrastructure-based competition. So it's an infrastructure-based competition only at upstream level, so the separation. So let's say there are these possible new tools in the code, co-investment, for example, one side, and wholesale only on the other side, could lead into different direction and also develop some different form of competition downstream, upstream. And of course, the role of regulator here is even more complex when there are the two of them, because there could be some trade-off between the two. For example, when setting access prices, of course, very generalizing, putting very simple, and it was evident in a regulatory appeal case in which I work at CMA on the access regulation Ofcom, on the city fiber, and also on setting the access prices. Of course, if you have low access prices, you will tend to promote competition more at downstream level, while if you have low access prices and the network of the incumbent, of course, it's more difficult for wholesale only operator and upstream only operator to enter into the market and compete. So there could be those trade-offs and tension that we were talked at the beginning could be reproposed in a different way. And the last thing, of course, the wholesale only model is based on the not the incumbent, so the competitors buying access products. So of course that's why I said it's kind of there is not an evolution, because of course it could become successful if competitors, alternative operator, buy access service from that company. So just to give a brief input on that, and I would like to have the opinion of the panelists, and who wants to talk first. You can decide about first the co-investment maybe, and the new tools. And I don't know if Martin maybe want to say something, not necessarily commenting what I said, but in general about.
No, I just like to say something which is based upon your very interesting diagram and imaginative diagram. I just like to draw attention to the huge gulf between infrastructure sharing, input sharing, and co-investment. And the obvious distinction is that if you're sharing a tower with another mobile operator, you know, you could have a purely business market, and the operator could have a purely household market, and it wouldn't impede the benefits of the sharing in any way. But as soon as you enter co-investment, so you're sharing revenue as well, as well as inputs, it's a completely different ballgame, and that's why I'd be very interested to see how the co-investment thing actually works out, because it does require a unity of purpose on the part of the investors for it to succeed. And I have seen occasions in other countries where altnets have tried to get together to form a united front via co-investment against the incumbent, and it really hasn't worked on the grounds that they can't really agree what day of the week it is, let alone how to conduct a strategy as a firm. So I can see that in certain circumstances, and this goes back to your geographical differentiation, if it's a question of providing shared investments in essentially giving coverage to areas which may not actually be very commercially advantageous, and various interests and motives are in place, as well as just simply profit maximization, then I can see co-investment working. But I do have my doubts about whether the unity of purpose is easy to succeed. Now, as these provisions of the code come into effect, we'll get some more data on that, and it'll be extremely interesting for me.
Of course, yeah, thank you very much. That's true. Of course, it's there's no implementation yet, so it's very difficult to understand at this very moment. But it's also something that I would like to ask Annegret, because of course, just because of the what we said, the balancing of the different objective, of course, co-investment as a balancement of incentive to investment and competition safeguard, which are very well, let's say, detailed in the provision and also in the BEREC guidelines. So in a way, this looks to you like a balance, of course, as you said, of the different objectives. So not focused only on the development of investment, but also keeping on promoting and maintaining competition in the market.
Yes, I think that's what the complexity of also the guidelines show, that there is the idea of, in the end, combining or complementing the two goals by reducing investment costs per operator, while at the same time maintaining competitive balance or competitive neutrality. In particular, also that the networks have to be open to third parties for the lifetime. I think that means that is a discussion we had a lot already on the base under the heading of more of the infrastructure sharing at the time that the NGA recommendation was discussed. On how to ensure that in the end you let's say you have a duopoly and you kill the rest of the alternative operators that do not have third-party access, of which then we also had the discussion in relation, by the way, to the letter of investment about the margin that it takes and the economic replicability test which follows from this. So I think these have to be together. So I think yes, but it also shows how, let's say, how difficult it is to use this instrument in the way that you are able to pursue both objectives, not going in one or the other direction. I think your diagram is very illustrative and instructive. I only would have one doubt about calling co-investment, where you have of course you invest in a joint infrastructure, but I would say it is still more than what you call service-based competition. So there is a a difference of order in this. Yeah? It's much, at least the way Article 76 is intended to work clearly foresees that it is not a pure kind of, let's say, wholesale discount, volume discount access model, yeah, like what we have in Germany for a particular type of bitstream access. So you have to have, for example, IDRs or other things that where you have a real joint investment by both, which I think then aims also for let's say probably not an element of what you have in the right upper right hand of pure infrastructure competition, but you have definitely more than service-based competition, I would say. So to be further developed. Nonetheless, I think that
I completely agree with you. Of course, it's a taxonomy, so of course there could be different degree, but it was just to illustrate, as you said. Of course, I completely agree with that. Okay, thank you very much. So I would pass to the second, let's say, big question that we receive about the infringement procedure and the delay of, I think, 23 member states of transposing the directive, if I'm right. I don't know if Alex and Camilla want to say something about it. Of course, also maybe it's also the difficulties to transpose, or do you think, Alex, could be also not only the problematic period, but also some problem in transposing because of the different tools that are there, or do you think it's just because of the problematic period?
I go first, and then Camilla. I don't know really. I didn't have follow. I think it's probably. I mean, the period doesn't help, but we should compare. You know, for the previous framework, I think there was also a lot of delay. So I mean, I'm not sure that it's. But I don't know. Camilla surely should know more. I'm not sure that it's specifically a problem. I just want, if I may, just say one point on this question, because I think it was interesting, the debate we had on whether it's BEREC guidelines or EC recommendation and so on. Now, my own take is that in general, the BEREC guidelines are much less prescriptive, as Hannah was saying, but because institutionally, I mean, this is easier to agree on something which is very open than what the Commission is doing. And I tend to agree that if we want to achieve harmonization, I mean, there is a question there, but if we want to achieve harmonization, I think the EC recommendation or soft law is much better in general than the BEREC guidelines, just because institutionally the Commission doesn't have to agree among itself, I mean, among 27 regulators. So, I mean, sorry, I thought it was very interesting, the different perspectives.
Can I just react on a very, very quick reaction? Well, we can debate about the let's say, comparability or level of BEREC guidelines and recommendations. My point was more that there is a risk of piling one soft law upon the others, and then, narrowing down the necessary discretion that NRAs need to have to more or less to zero. So that's my concern, and thereby missing out on the code.
Yes,
let's say, ending up in a very in a too prescriptive soft law edition. That's my concern.
That's clear. Yeah, and maybe Camilla also has a comment on that, on this last issue about harmonization recommendation versus BEREC guidelines, and also on the infringement procedure, because of course from the Commission side. I'm sure you cannot say too much, but still have some input from you, and then we close the debate.
Okay, so I will start with the code and infringements. In fact, I can say quite a lot about this, because I really think for the realization of all the goals that we have in the code, or really what Martin is saying, let's see how co-investment will work, how other incentives that we put in the code in terms of the deployment of very high capacity networks can materialize, in particular in these times that we are living now in, with the fact that connectivity became like almost basic utility for everybody. I think it's absolutely essential. So I wouldn't be surprised that the member that Commission decided, and I do represent Commission here in this meeting, with going relatively fast in terms of infringement. The round that you are referring to, Antonio, in the questions, it's very much about the fact if the communication of the transposition of the measures. We will have to go more deeply into the measures that were transposed in order to assess if they were transposed properly. But I think the fact that there is such a delay, it's just not good for Europe. It's not good for the member states. We need these provisions to work and not to be discussed. You see what I mean? So maybe that's on this part. On the issue that Annegret, discussion between Alexander and Annegret, I think it's very difficult. I wouldn't try to put recommendations that we are proposing above the BEREC guidelines. I think we all were trying to do good work on this. But I really think, as I said, I a bit disagree, and I don't often disagree with Annegret with this questioning or putting into question the proliferation of different tools. I don't think it's like this. I think there are also different purposes of the recommendations and directives. So the code is directive, it gives us general provisions, general direction. I don't think the fact that Commission is recommending something, and as I said, for the recommendation on relevant markets, we in fact shifted back regulations. So you cannot say that we are over prescriptive for the NRAs. Quite to contrary, I would say that we are regulating further. I don't think it's so much limiting the possibilities by NRAs to act. I think each situation is specific, and we provide in these recommendations room for maneuver for the regulators as well. We don't also completely close the possibility to regulate outside of the recommended market. If there is a problem, yes, and of course the NRAs can go through criteria tests, check the situation, and come back to us and say, yeah, we need to regulate here or there. That's not such a big issue. But it is important that there are principles around it, that there are clear recommends how it should be done, recognizing differences.
Okay, thank you very much, Camilla. Thank you, everybody. So I will thank you, everybody, for the debate. It was very interesting, and we are running out of time. I will give the floor to Professor Antonio Nishita, and I will show also as the last act the book that he wrote together with me about the governance of telecom markets, which is a nice also palette of green, could be very nice in your library. And so I will give the floor to Antonio for some of the conclusion, if it's one to it is possible, and then again just for the few last words to Augusto to close the event.
Well, thank you very much. Antonio will just say in very few minutes, and as Antonio just shown, maybe we need to add in electronic communications some norms referring to advertising within the Zoom presentation. It is a mix between telecommunications and the new audiovisual code. Beside that, thank you very much for organizing this. It was very interesting. And all the panelists really raised very interesting issues. So just let me focus on something that is opening the debate. First of all, very interesting insight from President La Sorella. I would like to focus on few points of his presentation. First of all, the idea of complementarity. Secondly, the idea of flexibility. Third, he stressed the fact that some debate was polarized and that the regulator has not all the responsibility for solving all the issues. And I really appreciated when he mentioned the role of universal services. This is, especially in Italy, an important point that is related to industrial policies. Actually, we need also to revise universal services in broadband and ultra broadband connection, because the limits we are actually really very far goes back in our history, while we need to assess what means social inclusion in terms of universal services in telecommunications now. This is not a topic that relies to the regulator, but of course the regulator could help if policymakers understand that this is a new challenge. So I really appreciate that mentioned, and also the fact that he mentioned the idea of governance. So we need the regulator, but also other institutional actors to do this job. And I think that the way he put the overall picture is today very important in Italy, particularly for the design of the Recovery and Resilience Fund, in which several investments are dedicated to both the supply side and the demand side. And I also appreciate that he mentioned the demand side instruments as important policy tools in Europe and in Italy as well. Moving to Martin's presentation, of course, I mean, Martin's ideas were really, as Camilla said, was really crafting and managing all this literature and also the regulation starting from the UK. Indeed, he precised and he mentioned how the idea of lateral investment was really crafted for the earlier stage of liberalization. And that was related to a given technological paradigm. And of course, it has been evolved over time. Sometimes I mentioned, looking at the stairs of the ladder of investment, I mentioned the stairs of Harry Potter saga, you know, this kind of stairs that are always moving. When you're just climbing the stair is going on another side and you never know where it's going. So develops uncertainty, or the stairs painted in some canvas by Escher, you know, for which you are going up and down at the same time. So we need to understand that Martin's idea was related to a specific paradigm in a specific time. And because of the success of the idea of splintering and entering a different stage of the chain values has actually pushed more competition. The problem that we had in the evolution of regulator was to understand that geographical fragmentation was an issue, especially in countries like Italy that had not a past legacy in terms of cable. So indeed, managing competition as if the geographical conditions in the market were the same was a little bit seen as today a sort of little bit misunderstanding at a certain point, because it was clear that we had entirely geographical areas that were not interested by competition. This was not an issue of the regulator, this was an issue of the policymaker, precisely on the way to manage market failures. So these raise an important issue that I will open, especially in terms of pandemic, because we all discovered that it's important to have this kind of connection for social inclusion, and it's important to have this connection in a shortest time. So once we introduce time as a constraint, then maybe we have to revise our idea of market failures, because probably in a longer future, some areas could be interested by competition dynamics, but in a time that is not acceptable for policy objectives. So again, there is an interplay between policy objective and competition and regulatory outcomes. And if there is a constraint to have to reach a given target of connection in due time, then probably we have to revise the boundaries between public and private actions. And again, I think that the recovery plan we are designing could help in solving some of these issues. Then going back to Annegret and Camilla discussion on guidelines and soft laws and flexibility, what I think is important is to understand that the European evolution, after all, has been a successful pattern. I was a little bit astonished by the announcement of the new FCC leader, chairwoman, few days ago, when she said we need to have a sustain of $50 per month for families for ultra broadband connections. Now, $50 per month in Europe is a huge amount, because on average, our prices of connection are very low. Sometimes this is a concern coming from operators, but it's indeed what Philip Pons says was the distinguishing feature of the European evolution of regulation and liberalization communications in Europe relative to the United States. So we had done very important results and outcomes. Still, we need to cover inclusions in terms of ultra broadband policies, both in fixed line and in mobile lines. And I think that the new framework will help precisely because it provides flexibility, and also it provides an enlarged tools of instruments. What is left? What is left is understanding where we are now, because I appreciated Camilla's mentions of utility, of course, of the utility function of telecommunication, but we have an important point that is utility on the one side and commodification on the other, because the idea is that probably the telecommunication services could become a commodity in the future. And after that, on the top of that, we have big techs, we have another word that is coming to be regulated, then we have to understand what the shifting of economic power will be in this larger picture. And let me focus on that, on a point that may deserve some further discussion, which is Recital 16 of the European Code of Telecommunication, that is somehow suggesting that the big data connections could be somehow a new form of communication services. That maybe this is the new frontier. Our book precisely ended on that, so I hope that our next efforts will be able to say something more on that, where we are, what will be the next neutrality issue in the evolution of telecommunication. So let me just thank everyone for this wonderful debate. And we have to stop now. A special thank to Annegret for quoting Ordo Liberalism here, that was a really nice suggestion for our future. Thank again to all. I think I have to close, Augusto. That's what we agreed. So thank you very much, and see you next time, I hope in presence. Bye.